Welcome everybody to 52 Living Ideas. Today is a Comprehensivist Wednesday that we do in collaboration with the Greater Philadelphia Thinking Society. Today we're going to be talking about intuition, and it's going to be Mike and Fred doing a kind of a back and forth and an interview, if you will. And then we're going to do breakout rooms, and then we come back with all the questions we have on intuitions and then try to answer all of them. That's the plan. Mike and Fred, the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much, Shrikant. Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming out. Quite a topic we're trying to tackle in 2 hours tonight. And when I first started looking into intuition, the roadblocks were tremendous. So what happened was I realized that it would be much more entertaining and instructive if I could figure out, or at least talk to somebody who I know is quite intuitive, who does it or uses the intuition in real time, and in real time with consequences. So I thought of my dear friend, Fred, Dr. Wang. Fred, let me get this right. Is it, you just went to your 50-year medical school reunion?
Correct, last week.
That is correct.
50th reunion.
And you are a pediatric ophthalmologist and a surgeon. I'm going to leave the rest out, Fred. We don't have time. You can kind of mix it in as we go, but the resume is quite extensive. So Fred, the reason I thought of you first is, for me, I do so much of, so much of my career is wrapped around doing things intuitively. And one thing that I have found that has helped my intuition over the years is, strangely enough, the use of analogy. And what do I mean by that? Having had to use it as a chess teacher in the classroom, connecting chess to all these various topics, over time, I started getting used to forcing myself to find these connections. And then what I found was there was harmony between my thoughts. So if I'm teaching a chess class and then all of a sudden we're talking about architecture, so my mind is already springing the chessboard into architecture. So what started to happen to me was, when something new would present itself in the classroom, more often than not, what came out of my mouth fit the current situation, because I was doing this in real time, right? I was with some teachers who were improvisational, and they would say, hey, we're doing a topic on architecture. I want you to connect chess to that, right? And then I would come into the classroom and they might say to me, change of plans. 2 of the kids are absent today. We're going to be talking about archaeology. And what happened to me is, instead of having that initial, panic, I jump back and go, oh man, I can't, I don't have a lesson plan for this. In time, because I was so used to connecting things through analogy, that thinking about archaeology in the moment became easy for me. And then I met you. And one of the first things I noticed about you is, we used to do this over the chessboard. So to fill the audience in, chess is what I do for a living, and Fred is my student. And we normally spend our time 3 feet away from each other. And as I was teaching you through analogy, Fred, you would not only come back on the same thread, but you would actually add some depth to it. Clearly just out of the medical field, but we would cover things like sports and science. We were just covering these whole runs. So when I was thinking of somebody who would fit the bill tonight, this being a Comprehensivist Wednesday, where there's talk of polymathy, and now we're going to talk about something specific in terms of real-time intuition, I couldn't think of a better presenter or someone to interview than you. So let me start with just a very simple question about intuition for you. Before you hit medical school, was it swirling around inside? Were you generally an intuitive person?
I think so, yes. But I think like there's no magic. There's probably no intuition if we break it down. What we think of someone as having intuition is a whole combination, I think, of experience, planning, understanding the possibilities, understanding the ramifications of a certain decision, having a clear mission in mind, understanding. If intuition is defined as the person who guesses the right answer, I think that the guesswork is a combination of all those other things. It's understanding in real time what the right answer is likely to be. I don't think it's a guess. And I think it comes from training. There are people who have logical minds and understand what all the possibilities are and can very quickly go through those, understanding what he's trying to do. Like in the operating room, we have a lot of expressions that are thrown out. And one of those is perfect is the enemy of good. So that will help you make a decision in the operating room. Do no harm. Understanding what your limitations are. Having the right amount of anxiety. You know, you see that in chess. Too much anxiety doesn't allow you to function. Not enough anxiety doesn't raise your sympathetic system to the point of maximizing your calculating ability. And just like in chess, if you intuition is a very rapid calculation of handling so many parameters that someone thinks it's intuition.
Correct. But there was something interesting that you and I, because we have something in common. We both work with kids. You're a pediatric ophthalmologist and surgeon. So primarily most of what you've done is with kids. And
right.
And that's the same for me because most of my students are of a certain age. So the next question I have for you, or the next topic is, I've always saw my business as of something like a triangle, and I see the same in yours. And what I mean is there's myself as a coach or as a teacher. And then I have the student, which if it's a child, comes with a third part, which completes the triangle, which is the parent or the guardian. So separate from your technical work as a surgeon, how do you interact in that triangle? In other words, do you see certain problems developing just initially? Like sometimes, can you talk about that first moment when you see a kid, a patient? Do you already formulate that relationship between the guardian, yourself, and the patient?
Yes, I think you do. I think I look at how parents interact with their children and how they interact with me. And I certainly look at how the child interacts with me, because that says a lot about you know, what I'm going to be looking for. I deal a lot with strabismus, people who aren't straight. In fact, I'm giving a lecture in Washington on the effect of strabismus on the observer. So it has nothing to do with whether people lose their depth perception and people pass point and can't pick up a glass or have a different feel. It's how do we feel about looking at someone who has an eye that's not straight, that's not parallel. That's what strabismus is. And what does that do to us? And I've actually done functional MRIs studying how it makes us feel. So yeah, there's all these instant calculations that go into all of these interactions. And if you have enough experience and enough intuition, then you make proper decisions.
Okay. Now you also, you know, I've been listening all these years when we chat, when we have these conversations over the board.
Right.
And so I'm not really sure who the teacher or the student actually is, but in your practice, I don't know why you do this, but you do. You handle the banking, You handle
I do.
a lot of the hiring and the firing. You handle so much of the interpersonal connection there. I remember you having conversations about being called into court as an expert in a case. So you're
Right.
dealing with attorneys and you're dealing with judges, you're dealing with a whole host of people. So another line of questioning would be, when you meet somebody that you know you're going to have an interaction with outside of the sphere of medicine, it's kind of connected to your practice. Like, do you have something going on in the background in terms of, you meet the person, say it's an attorney, you might be having a case that you're going to have to present at. Do you get the same kind of emotional stirring inside, or intuitive stirring?
Well, I try to size people up. I'm not someone who's particularly impressed by titles or education necessarily. I'm someone who evaluates every individual that I meet quite independently. I mean, I don't know how much this group knows about you, but you're one of the brightest people I know, Mike. And certainly,
You need to
know,
get
you
out
could-
more, Fred.
you could put in your eye your educational degrees and you wouldn't feel them. So, one doesn't have to have a list of credentials in order to be a very bright, well-educated, without the degrees individual. And I try to size people up. I live in a toity town, and I often, if I go to an affair, find that I have more in common with the waiter than most of the people at my table. So,
Right.
I really try to look at individuals as individuals. I think everybody, as you've often pointed out, has something to bring to the table. I think the more intuitive person really senses and takes in his environment, the people he's talking to. And one thing we have to say that gives you intuition is remembering your past, remembering your mistakes, remembering your education, remembering what people told you, and try to progress in that way. It's something that, you can make the same unintuitive mistake over and over and over.
Yeah. But
I
then,
guess part of it has to do with how many of us can really look at ourselves and our work and understand, I have a son who's an attorney, and we had an interesting conversation once. He said to me, one of the things that I don't have, Dad, in terms of doing law is I don't think everything I say is right. And good lawyers often, I get the idea, think everything they say is right. I said, because it's interesting, because in medicine, you better say to yourself, every time you state a fact, is that right? Does it still fit when the patient comes back who you've diagnosed with diabetes, does his new symptom fit that disease, or were you wrong? Does his weight loss fit that disease? Does his urinary history fit that disease? Does everything keep fitting that disease? You have to constantly question. And I think an intuitive person constantly questions. So it's not just a blind guess. It's what a servo mechanism is. You do something and it changes, your direction. And I think you have to be nimble in that regard. And that gives you an intuition.
right. I make the distinction between people who seem to be able to improvise on the spot sometimes. For example, I always think of Robin Williams, who was thought to be, and is, or was, a tremendous improviser. But Robin Williams had a tremendous database of voices and sketches and ideas in his head that he could just reach in and pull out. And I'm not sure that that's really intuition. That, to me, that always felt like more of a speed of access technique, where sometimes in intuition, for example, in chess, I had seen very young players who haven't been on the planet long enough to have gathered a database as big as Robin Williams in the comedic sense. They haven't been on the planet long enough. And they certainly don't have the vocabulary to put into words what they're doing sometimes. But I have seen kids at a very young age play moves that don't really change a computer evaluation. So they haven't found the miracle move. And if you look at their position carefully, they did have a choice. And they seem to be putting the pieces on the right squares. So to me, there's a distinction there, right? They're not drawing from a database. They're not drawing from prior knowledge. It's in the moment. And for some reason, why does kid A seem to, I guess, intuitively put the piece on that square more than player B? Does that make sense?
It does, but I think because player A, although he's not sure of the move, he understands the mission. One of the first things in any decision is to really understand the question. If you really don't understand the question, you can't have intuition. But if you really understand the question, then you have an idea of where you want to go. And if you have an idea of where you want to go, then maybe moving the piece to this square instead of that square looks more like it's in the right direction. So it's not like a total random guess. It's behind door 1 or behind door 2. You have an idea of what you want this to look like at the end. And just like in the OR, you have an idea of what it wants to look like in the end. And if something goes wrong, if you have a complication, and as you learn in surgical training, the only way to not have complications is not to operate.
Huh.
We had a guy who was so bad in our surgical training. I won't mention any names, but we went to the chief and said, why do we have to operate with Dr. So-and-so? Because he's terrible. And the chief said, you're going to learn how to deal with complications. So it's all part of the game. You know, you gotta learn how to deal with complications.
Right.
And how do you deal with complications? I think the first thing is that you have to have gone through it in real time. I don't know if people realize this, but like the Marines in Paris Island, when they go through training, they go through training with live ammunition. They have machine guns set up underneath these obstacle courses that when these guys crawl underneath the barbed wire and have to keep their head less than 3 feet, there is live ammunition over their heads. So I guess what I'm saying is you have to simulate real time. Like if you want to really become a grandmaster chess player, you shouldn't play blitz online on the train all day. You should be under those circumstances where you're going to play, and you should do it. And no matter what your task, you will have better intuition if you've been in that situation before. So how do you get in that situation? You mirror it. You mimic it as much as you possibly can.
Yeah, I was a big fan of that for many years in the tournament hall or the training hall where we're playing. But this is, so we have in common things that I mentioned, but one thing that we don't have in common is we may have the same technique of working with students or with patients, but there is a huge difference in terms of consequence. So if I do want to put my students in a real-time situation, I do everything in my power to mimic the tournament hall so that when they get in there, they have built up some storage that they can reach into and use in real time. The consequence of me screwing up my tutelage is that a kid loses a chess game. The worst that can happen to me is the parent might say, we're going to another coach. But in your case, now talking specifically about the OR, you're there in real time, and I'm assuming there is theoretical, and you're trained in protocol. And it's not like, what I want to get at with you, Fred, is not doing surgery for the first time, because that you might feel performance anxiety. You can certainly talk about that later. What I'm much more interested in hearing about from you is when you are the chief surgeon, or you are the physician in charge, and something unprecedented happens in that moment. What takes over, and where does that decision germinate?
Right. I think the same thing, that you have to take over. So obviously people, not everybody, not every resident makes it through training. I'm sure not every pilot makes it through training. There are some people who, I guess their autonomic nervous system allows them to function a little bit better under pressure. And then it's the same thing. You have a mission. It's often said in operating theaters that good surgeons aren't the people who do routine cases well. Good surgeons are the people who take complications and get adequate results. Okay, your surgeon, if he has a complication, you want to get out of that operating room with an adequate result. You have to have that eye put back together. You want to be able to see out of that eye. It doesn't have to be a pretty perfect result, but so he's planned this all along. He knows what the possible complications are and knows how to handle them. You spend a tremendous amount of time in surgical training learning about complications. And he also may have people around that he can call on. He's not really alone if he has a retina person or a cornea person or some specialist within the hospital that he needs to kind of bail him out. That happens occasionally.
Mm-hmm.
Someone's putting in an intraocular lens and it falls into the eye. They call a retina person to fish it out and save the retina. So a lot of it is from intuition in terms of experience, training, and knowing the possibilities.
And Fred, do you, or have you ever seen? Because I know you've written so much and you've lectured so much too. So if you were to go back to a medical school and you were to do something like an experiment that somebody like Malcolm Gladwell might be interested in, if you could walk into a room and say in front of 10 medical students first, second year, would you be able, through just some general conversation, intuitively kind of set their path, almost predict where they might be in 6 to 12 months?
By talking to them?
Yes.
Oh, sure. There's a big difference between.
Could you share like what some of those things you would look for? What?
Yeah, I mean, there are people who are very systematic. When you answer a question, you see their brain ticking already, and they've outlined the entire question, and they have bullet points. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. There are other people who kind of have a gestalt, who have a kind of a global approach to it. Maybe certain professions are more suited for people who have different ways of thinking. I think different ways of thinking produce a wonderful world, a wonderful array of people. We have poets and we have computer programs. And I'm not sure you want a poet programming your computer. You want someone who's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, etc. And I'm not sure you want a computer programmer writing your poetry necessarily.
Yeah, you should join us on a Monday night here to one of our poetry meetups, because you'll see exactly that. You will see just an incredible group of people who you'd never think could create poetry, myself included, and that's a real blast. But I know exactly what you meant by that. Yeah.
So in terms of people, there are different specialties. You want your neurologist to have one gestalt, you want your psychiatrist to have a different one. You want your pediatrician to have a certain relatability, where your pathologist doesn't necessarily need that skill, but has to be very analytical and very resourceful and very knowledgeable about what the pathology is and what the pathophysiology is. I think the other thing I'd like to say about intuition is, we talked a little bit about analyzing the situation, but there are people who know subjects at very different levels. I'm sort of a scientist. When I go and walk along a frozen lake, now Emerson would probably write a poem. I'm thinking about how the hydrogen bonding allows the ice to be less dense than the water. Otherwise, ice, because everything else when it gets colder gets more dense, and it would go down, and then all the fish would die, and we wouldn't have any food cycle. And I'm having, so then if something happens to the ice, I have just a totally different understanding of that frozen lake than my wife who's walking next to me. And if you ask me about some rock falling on it, yeah, my intuition is going to be different than hers. So when we think of intuition, we also have to understand how much does this person really breathe and live and feel the subject that we're asking them to be intuitive about.
So it sounds like there is a something of an argument for experience being a big factor in terms of real time. You know, if there's somebody in the audience tonight, for example, who says they know a lot theoretically about their subject, but in real time they're not making the best decision. Perhaps it's a lack of experience,
right,
that is probably leading them there.
Experience has a lot of definitions, one of which, at least in terms of surgery, is experience is what you get when you didn't get what you want.
Yeah, very good. Very good. So I have this vision in my head always when in talking in real time, that when I am struck with something that is unexpected in real time, the mechanics of my intellect collide with my emotions. And it's usually my emotions that lead the charge. So doing some prep for this meetup, that's what made the topic very difficult to talk about, because I found intuition and emotional intelligence to be sort of bonded. And I don't run on technical information. It's very interesting that I think that's the reason why when I'm solving problems, a lot of the times, the initial response is more intuitive than calculated. I worked on Wall Street, on the American Stock Exchange, and I had a business degree, and I was bored to tears studying economics, and some people are absolutely fascinated by it. And I did well enough. My math skills were okay. I did pretty well, but I didn't really begin to understand markets until I hit the floor of the exchange, because the exchange was just an amazing array of personal interaction in real time. You know, you're buying or selling an option or a stock or an equity in a crowd of people that are literally rocking because they're anxious and they're moving, and you're looking up at a ticker tape that's moving by. The math involved there is not really complicated. A lot of times it's nothing more than arithmetic, but I always say I learned more just being on that floor, just the experience of physically being there, than I did in college. So it seems that I even some trading decisions I make today, if I stop and analyze them after the trade, I realize that a lot of it was based on an intuitive pulling of the trigger. And I'm not always wrong. I think my feel is not bad, but I probably should be a little more analytical. It's just the way I'm wired. So I'm curious later on to find out if there's any other people here that feel that their intuition and their emotional intelligence are wrapped as one. It's a hard kind of concept to define. So my next question or direction for you is, what do you do with your emotions? I've never really seen you angry, to tell you the truth. So, but in real,
We haven't talked to my daughters,
well, your daughter's another story, right?
but
But I mean, this is a big question. How do you handle your emotions in real time?
well, I think, just as an aside, but it really answers that question, is I think we all should understand in all these subjects, and I'm a big proponent of this, to understand that we're animals, we're humans. We're not machines, no matter how good our mind is. We are animals. And we have this autonomic nervous system that when something terrible happens, all of a sudden, that kicks in. Your amygdala may be nauseated by something. It goes to your autonomic nervous system. Your pupils dilate. Your heart starts racing. You are in no condition at that moment to I don't know how Sully did it, but maybe land that plane on the Hudson. You like, Mike, you taught me, when something happens in chess and it looks like a whole nother part of the game and you've been thrown by a move and you have a little time on your clock, get up, stretch your back, go back to the board, start all over. Don't just react. So we should all understand that we are human beings, and we should let our autonomic nervous system quiet down a little bit. It may take 2 minutes, it may take 3 minutes. Very few things can't wait for that period of time. That's how long it takes. So all of us shouldn't be reacting, even intuitively, in that very spontaneous time when our amygdala has gone to our vagus nerve and shut it down and our heart is racing. So that's not a good time to make those decisions.
Right.
If we all understand that we're human, then I think we can go ahead and start making better decisions. And that comes from experience. I mean, when I was in the military, I saw officers that under very tough circumstances behaved better than other officers. And I think that realizing that they're human, realizing our limitations, realizing what we can change. It always reminds me of the Russian immigrant who is given his citizenship and can't understand why the next day he woke up, he still has a Russian accent. Things don't necessarily change instantly the way we want. But I think if we recognize our humanness and recognize other people's humanness, we start to understand how different we are. And I think intuition probably has to do with how you think. So some people have better intuition in one field where they have experience and knowledge and a basic understanding, and not in other fields where their best friend may be the opposite.
Yeah. So we're about to head off to the breakout rooms to kick some of this stuff around. There's just one question I want to ask you directly, because you have grandkids and you've been teaching. You've been caring for children for so many years in the profession. In general, do you think it's a skill or a process that can be honed? And I'll just briefly add before you answer that that is one of the selling points, that if I don't have to sell a chess curriculum, but if I did, it would be one of the selling points where I would tell an administration or a school board that if you can get students to play chess competitively, and it's important that it's competitively because you're playing with a clock and there are again the consequences, that they are going to be making, I couldn't quantify how many decisions over their chess career in real time, and some of them are being made without concrete calculation. Sometimes in chess you sacrifice a piece, so you're taking what you think is a measured risk, but it is still a risk because the answer is not concrete. It's not like a forced checkmate. So I've always said from my end that I think it's a wonderful game for kids to play competitively for that specific reason. You can hone it, but I'm not sure that's universal. So from your perspective, do you think one's intuition or the ability to act in real time, is it something that can be honed?
To some extent, yeah. I mean, things can be trained, but I think if you're asking me, are there some people who are just better at it? I think that brains are different. And I think people think differently. They have different MOs. They have different ways of thinking. And the secret with a child is to find his way of thinking. And what does it fit? I mean, you know, Andrew, my son, is, amazingly uni-talented. He does music. He does nothing else. If you give him something musical, he has tremendous intuition. You give him anything else, he has terrible intuition. So, but that's the way his brain is wired. And I think that some of it may be genetic. I mean, otherwise we wouldn't have the Bachs, and we wouldn't have look at some of the famous chess families and some of the other famous mathematician families, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, I think that there are human differences and that it does interface what we're calling intuition. But anything can be trained past that. You could take tremendous athletes and they can still become better baseball players. You can still teach a great batter how to hit better because there are other skills.
Dr. Wang, I can't thank you enough for the time spent. And again, I sincerely meant when I said that I have become the student, not the teacher. Thank you so much.
Now, hardly true. Hardly true. I can't beat him. Can't get near him.
Thank you so much. Shrikant, we can head in now. I just, they're kind of open-ended. I just thought people could share at least somewhat their own experiences in terms of, are they using intuition in real time? Any experience to share with us would be a great starting point, and then you can explain the rest.
Wonderful. Fred, that was wonderful. I just loved everything that you said. This is a fantastic topic, and I'm really curious to see what people have to say about it. So folks, in the breakout rooms, talk about your own experience of intuition and try to come up with questions that you have for intuitions. Okay, on any topic on intuition, you can come at it from any angle that you want. Try to come up with questions. And when we come back, we're going to run the breakout rooms for only 20 minutes. When you come back, put your best question on the table. Okay, there are going to be 3 breakout rooms. They're going to be facilitated by Becky, Mike, and Fred, assisted by Joe. Okay, so Fred has not done a breakout room before, so Joe is going to be there, and just lead any discussion that you want. But the aim is to come up with questions, and we will gather all the questions that everybody has, and then all of us are going to be trying to answer the questions. All right, that's the plan. Starting the breakout rooms now. Welcome back, folks. Welcome back. All right, so now it is time for putting your questions on the table. You're welcome to make very brief comments if you want as well. Let's put everything on the table, all your thoughts, all your questions, and then let's see. I really liked what Fred had to say. So we'll figure out how to do this. But first, I want to hear from everybody about what questions they have about intuition, and if you have brief comments about intuition. Go ahead and type an exclamation mark if you'd like to speak. We're going to start with Jeng, Joe, Becky, and Madhav. Jeng, go ahead.
Yeah, so I'm actually in an all-female discussion group, And we all get conclusion. Women in general are more intuitive. And intuition is more rely on right brain than left brain. And it's kind of like work with subconsciousness, everything, all the knowledge you have together, even your body feeling. And it's way superior than just rational thinking. And we think the reason society downplay intuition because this society is dominated by men, the philosophy, all the other things. So they downplay, they think it's not as important. But with all the study we have, we understand it's more advanced knowledge. Like we ask to fully understand it, we can explain, but it's more superior in general. So we have to integrate more intuition in our society, let more women lead to balance it out.
Thank you, Jen. Did you want to put any question on the table?
My question is, I'm still a little bit confused. The intuition and sensing in Carl Jung is the opposite, but it feels like intuition a lot of time is how you feel other people. So I'm a little bit confused about this too.
Sure. Okay, very good. Intuition and sensing. Excellent. Thank you. Thank you. So I'm keeping track of comments as well as questions, and then I will summarize everything as best as I can. I'm not going to be able to get all the details and all the nuances that everybody says, but I'm going to try to do that. So we see a picture of what is emerging, and we'll go from there. Sure.
So in the way of comments, I may need to think about that a little bit more. Maybe I'll just say one thing briefly is that I think understanding bias in general is really kind of important in kind of developing your intuition and the different forms of bias that you may have. So like the idea that you've gone through something recently traumatic or something like that, and how that bias actually may impact how you react in a particular situation. So there is actually something called like the recency bias, or how we selectively look at facts, that fit a certain narrative. I think understanding these allow us to develop our intuition, and so that's just a general comment. And I have a couple more comments that I could probably offer, but I'll leave it at that for now. But my question would probably, there's a couple questions that I have, but one in particular that I would be interested in hearing what the group has to say is that the role of specialization and how that relates to intuition. Now, does it hurt it or does it help it? Because it's not really clear to me sometimes. Sure. Because, and actually there's a lot of studies that suggest that being over specialized actually can, again, make you essentially, you'll defer to your biases as opposed to looking at things objectively. Therefore, your intuition may be actually harmed. But some people also have said, you need a certain amount of experience in a field to develop intuition. Wonderful. So anyway, I would like to hear what you.
Thank you, Joe. Next up is going to be Becky, followed by Madhav. Becky.
Okay, so how do you define or characterize intuition? So for example, we mentioned speed, right? So something that's quick, like blink from Malcolm Gladwell's book. But well, there's also speed as in like, well, I know the rules, so I can throw something out quickly. Or, what another thing that was brought up was recall. I have something memorized. Do you call that necessarily intuition? And most of us would say no. So what else? And then it's like, well, maybe it's something with consciousness. And well, knowing something, a fact, that you've grown up with forever, you allocate that, you don't even think about that, that's out of consciousness, and you can always throw it out. Is that necessarily intuition? Once again, it probably would be no. So how do you define or characterize intuition? And then another question would be, what is the correlation between the hemispheres of the brain and intuition? Mm-hmm. This was brought up in the breakout room, and Mike also brought this up. what's the connection between emotions and intuition.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Becky. Next up is going to be Madhav. Madhav followed by Jyoti. Madhav.
Okay. In chess, there's something called a prophylactic move, where you make a move anticipating an opponent's move, trying to prevent that move. So my question is, how much or how is anticipation related to intuition? Are they synonyms? Is it a part? Just the relations between the two.
Wonderful. Excellent. Thank you. Next question or comments from Jyoti, followed by Allison. Jyoti.
Yeah, okay. What I said in my breakout room was your exposure to the different experiences and your ability to assimilate all those experiences in a short period of time kicks out the intuition. But now that I'm not in the same field that I was in, and I'm in the business, I use completely I'm taking risks based on the intuition. I have no background experience, but I look at the situation and I said, oh no, I can do this. I think it will work out for me. And it does. So I don't know, in first situation, it was my background, it was my experiences, it was my exposure, it was my ability to determine predict the outcomes. Now, how I'm using this intuition and what are the bases of it, I have no idea. So far they are working out, but I have no idea. So what I'm trying to say is sometimes you know what intuition is, what you are dealing with, what resources you are pulling out, and sometimes you just don't know. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jyoti. Next up is going to be Allison, followed by Laura. Allison.
Okay, so I found a quote that I want to read before I give my question. It said, I seriously wonder how many highly intuitive, intelligent, and totally sane women and men have been labeled as crazy because they got too close to figuring out someone else's bullshit. So my question is, why is it that if somebody's really good at basketball, say, we think they're really talented, but if somebody is really intuitive, we think they're crazy?
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Allison. Next up, let me make sure I get this down. Okay. Next up is going to be Laura, Brian, and Sydney. Laura.
Well, I talked about my intuition being an amalgamation of experiences that I developed because I needed to understand who my students were. So collecting all these, and so the end of the day was, how do I know whether my intuition is true or not? Can I trust it?
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. Next up is Brian, followed by Sydney.
So I have kind of a follow-up question based on Jean's initial comment. So may I just say a couple sentences and then give the question?
Mm-hmm.
She said we should have more women leaders, and I agree with that. But and I think it would be great. But I think how did I write this? Why should other people follow you if you cannot articulate reasons for your leadership or reasons for your action? And I say that because you want intuitive people to be leaders, and I think that the process of intuition is good, but it's not sufficient for leadership, because in leadership you have to be able to articulate your reasons, and once you can do that, it's no longer intuition.
Wonderful, thank you. Next up is going to be Sydney. Sydney, go ahead.
Thank you. There's a question I have, but I think in response to what Brian just said, I also think leadership is grounded in, has followers when you do what you say you're going to do, and if it's intuition or not. And so I don't think it has to be based exactly on what he was saying. But people will follow
Sure.
if you're honest and do it. Now, the question I have
Mhm.
is from the definition of understand something immediately without the need for conscious reasoning is two-part. The first part is, so understanding something immediately, how do you know you're understanding it or understanding it accurately? So the follow-up to that is, do we need to test ourselves? Should we see if it works each time? Was I on track in order to learn if I really am understanding something properly immediately?
Wonderful. Excellent. Thank you. Evanique.
Following up on Brian's point, my question would be, can you articulate intuition? So I understand that like when you are leading people, you have to give them a reason as to why they should follow you or why they should go along. It's not just because I told you so, but can you articulate what's going on in your gut? Like it can be, based on this, I feel this way. And maybe you don't have concrete facts to support it because it's a new idea or a new question or a new problem and you're coming up with solutions. So my question is, so that's what leads me to the question, can intuition be articulated?
Wonderful. Becky, go ahead.
I want to respond to this too.
Don't respond to anything. Just you can put more questions on the table because I want to put all of them, everything everybody has said. I want to put it down and then we can go ahead and respond.
Okay, it's somewhat related.
Okay, go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay, so leadership and intuition. Well, it's like if you have one or the other, there's a shortfall. You can't. It's not full. You can't just have intuition and expect anyone to follow you because the lack of communication. But if you only have like your rules based, you might end up in leadership and middle management. But if you look at like the top leaders with the vision, they're the ones with the intuition, but they've mastered the communication skills in order to lead. So, but what sets us apart, I want to say, is judgment. So how is judgment different from intuition?
Wonderful. Folks, now I'm going to summarize all the points and then we can go ahead and see where it leads. Okay, I'm really, really curious to see how, what everybody has said, because I'll try to put it in brief. So first point was Zheng's point that women are more intuitive. Intuition is more right-brained. It is more about leveraging your subconscious. Whereas explicit thinking is mostly done by, men do mostly explicit thinking using left brain and conscious, that distinction. The next question was about the relationship between intuition and sensing that Carl Jung talks about. Next issue was the role of biases and intuitions, how biases shape intuition. Next point, what is the role of specialization in shaping intuition? Is it conducive to increasing the intuition or does it decrease the intuition? If you're more comprehensivist, do you have more intuition or less intuition? Or does it depend? How do you define intuition? Maybe we should start with that. Okay, so I would definitely want to start with that question so I can give you something to start thinking about. Okay, what is intuition? You will have to try to put it as briefly as you can, and we will hear as many answers. So we'll start with that. Next is, this is my question after listening to Fred's presentation. Fred made an excellent case for how preparation, very deep and long and elaborate preparation, is the ground that is shaping your intuitions. So that connection between preparation and intuition. What is the relationship between emotion and intuition? What is the role of, what is anticipation and what is its relationship to intuition? Is intuition shaped by your exposure and experience? What's the role of your experience and exposure in shaping intuition? Why is it that many people think that intuitive people are crazy? Can you trust your intuition? Should you be testing your intuition? What is the role of intuition and articulation in leadership? Is intuition, can it be defined as acting immediately, quickly, without conscious thought? Is it necessarily without conscious thought? What is the relationship between conscious thought and intuition? Can you articulate intuition? So these are some of the questions that some of the issues that we're going to be discussing. So we're going to start with the question of, what do you think intuition is? And we will build on that. As I'm listening to the answers, I will select like bunches of questions, and then we'll deal with bunches of questions. So first one, I want to do the question, because there is a whole bunch of things that are going to come from that. So my plan right now is to start with, what is intuition, and then talk about the role of your exposure, experience, preparation in shaping your intuition. We can bring in, whether it is specialization and, comprehensive work. Does it require tests? So we'll look at the nature of what intuition is, how it is, how it is shaped. That will be the second question. So first question, folks, is what is intuition? So we'll start with Fred, followed by Jen. Fred. Fred, you need to unmute yourself.
Thank everybody for their comments. I thought they were wonderful, and thank you for putting everything together so well. From listening to all this, I've come to the idea that intuition is an educated guess. And the key is not guess, but educated. All the things that go into that word. And I think the one other word that we haven't used is time. And that is, when you don't have a lot of time, you use your intuition. If you had a lot of time, you might be using other modalities to solve the problem. So I would like to add the word time. Leonard Bernstein said, if you want to do something very creative, you have to have a great idea and not quite enough time.
Wonderful. Fantastic point. Thank you. Thank you, Fred. Next up is going to be Jeng, Joe, and Jyoti. What is intuition?
I think intuition, my understanding is you were able to detect the relationship with all the things that seems to have no relationship. So you were able to make connections, find the underlying principle or connection or similarity, whatever. You can find those things that are not obvious to most of the people. The deeper you can feel that, the Tao, the more intuition you get, or the principle. And about the time, the book Blink, I think that was I read, they said the more time you have, actually, for example, when you do a text, the more time you have, usually you get the wrong answer. The first intuitive answer usually is correct. So I think time sometimes is our enemy.
Thank you. Next up is going to be Joe, Jyoti, Allison, Mike, and Sydney. Joe.
I think intuition is the ability to act without consciously thinking about what your action actually, what you're going to do. So we actually talked about in our room was the idea of how to use principles actually as a way of actually developing your intuition. So that you're able to adapt into any situation. And that's where the idea, the question I my question is essentially the genesis of my question was, if you're basically using principles as opposed to your experiences, that you're able to adapt very quickly. So to me, I define just it to be able to act without consciously thinking, but then how do principles relate within that framework?
Thank you. Jyoti, what is intuition?
Okay, I think it's a non-verbal, logical, and fluid reasoning.
Okay, excellent. Next up is Allison. Allison, what is intuition?
It's reading between the lines. And I think a really big part of it is reading body language and noticing tone, noticing eye movement, noticing twitching, noticing, all of those things that most people aren't paying attention to. But I think in other fields, I think that's true for many types of intuition. But for some things like the pilot, Scully, who landed his plane on the river, a lot of that seemed like intuition because he wasn't able to use all of the technology. But really, it was so much experience that he'd had over so many years that when he was suddenly thrown into this horrendous situation, he could draw on it. So I guess really it was like it all went into this unconscious and he was able to bring it up when he needed it. So I feel like the idea that intuition is not rational is not really true at all. It's very rational. It's just that most people aren't paying attention, whether it's the plane or the body language or the whatever it is. And and we're in our group, we were saying certain fields, you have to pay more attention, like a security guard or a museum guard. All they do all day long is watch people walk around the museum. So they have to know every single thing about every person.
Thank you. Thank you, Allison. Mike, what is intuition?
Which mic do you want?
Mike S., the one who is speaking now.
Okay, it's an adaptive toolbox of heuristics, rules of thumb that you've learned through experience for solving problems that are too complicated to solve or too many variables to solve analytically, but you've learned how to solve them through experience approximately. Even though your methodology may be wrong, but you're able to decide how to do things that come up with a good result. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Mike. Sydney, what is intuition?
Thank you. What I think it is, I've been wrestling my mind when Dr. Wang said about educated guess, because that implies that you need to have some information in order to do it. So I'm still thinking about that. But I think to me, intuition is a sense of knowing without knowing why you know.
Thank you. Thank you, Sydney. Laura, what is intuition?
I think it's that you gather all these pieces of information from the multitude that you have that allow you to create like a revelation that gives you an insight or a way to approach something new.
Wonderful. Thank you, Laura. Next up is Kay. Kay, what is intuition?
I see it as broader than what I've been hearing. I've looked at, are any of you familiar with remote viewing?
No.
This is a program done by the government to test what is psychic, in which they were able to actually, under very controlled circumstances, get impressions on things just from nowhere. And that's all on the record. Anybody interested, I can tell you more about it. But there are many other things like that, that there may be access to information we don't actually have, or that it's out there in the collective unconscious, like you said with Jung. But in general, I think it's that creative leap. And I think, close to what Sydney was saying, that you don't know why you know, but you know it. And it does take experience and testing to tell the difference between that and emotions or logic. It's a mix of everything. You can't say it's just one, but it's using every sense that we know of or not, I guess I'd put it at.
Wonderful. Thank you. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to go along two paths, because there is one thing that I heard throughout all the answers here is, wait a minute, Fred, did you have any comments?
No, I think everybody, some of these differences in the definition of intuition, I think that we've gotten has to do with the application of when we're using that intuition. But I think everybody's made very, very salient points
Okay.
toward the goal.
Oh, very good. So I want to go in 2 steps. I want to look at one question that came up because many people stressed the fact that, when the intuition is happening, it is automatic. It is immediate reaction to something. And then there is it has a tail, it has a history. The point that Fred was making about educated. So there is the education behind some of the immediate actions. So let me put it as a question. What is the interaction between the conscious work that you've done in the past and intuition? So that's one question I want to put first. And then I'm going to expand that question to saying, how is, when you say that somebody is really, really intuitive about something, how did they come to be that way? What kind of preparation, etc., is involved in that? So you can answer both of them or one of them. Go ahead and type exclamation mark. So how does intuition come to be? How do people get to be very good at doing things? Surgeon is a very good example. The same thing is true for an artist, like a dancer or a singer. It has to kind of flow through you. The same thing is true for a scientist. So the question is, what are the antecedents and what's the role? Sub-question there is, what is the interaction between conscious action and intuition? We're going to start with Evanik, followed by Joe. Go ahead and type exclamation mark if you'd like to answer this question. Evanik.
So I think what the relation is between conscious or from the past and intuition is that it's like sometimes it can be based on your past experience. Like you like if you're interacting, like I say, if I'm interacting with a person and I get this feeling that this person is not being straight with me. And the reason why I get that is because I've had this past experience of when people have exhibited this exact behavior, they're not being straight with me. Then I have an intuition. So what it may lead me to do in a very conscious way is to ask them certain questions, to get a feel for them, to get a better feel for them, and then decide or choose whether I am going to trust that person or whether I'm just going to take what they say with a grain of salt and walk away. And I always use the example of, which always people said sound weird. It's like when I meet a person, I have a vibe or an energy about the person. And it's like, I can't put my finger on it, but I'm usually right. And other people would tell me, oh no, you don't really know that person, they're a good person, whatever. And usually like down the road, they find out that I'm right. And I'm like, yeah, it's just that person's energy was just, and it's probably based on my past experience. That person's energy is off. So I think that's the key, is like you do bring your past experiences into it, but you also, and sometimes you ignore it, but sometimes you have a feeling about a person that something's not right or something that they're doing is not right. So I think that's the relation.
Wonderful, thank you. Joe, how does intuition come to be? How is intuition trained? How is it built?
I like the second question better. I mean, only because in itself. That's the one I'm going to try and focus on.
Sure.
I really like what Daniel Kahneman has to say on this particular topic, is that we can train our intuition by taking feedback from people's system too. And essentially that we're learning from their conscious actions. and that we're integrating it, and then we can train our own intuition based on that. So I think that it's something in the handbook for New Stokes, which we covered here actually in the past, they actually talk about training your intuition in one of the weeks, and basically questioning every action that you're taking during the week, essentially, which is very, very hard to do. But within that, you can develop a habit that allows you to react under certain circumstances. And I think that this is essentially what you see out of a lot of military training in survivability kind of situations as well. And that's all. Yeah.
Thank you. For those who are not familiar with the work of Daniel Kahneman, he has this idea of system 1 and system 2. System 1 is the elephant and system 2 is the rider. And the elephant is the large part of our brain, which is automatic, and the rider is the one who is directing it. So at a given point of time, elephant is doing what it is doing, but the rider over time can dramatically transform the nature of the elephant. So there is this back and forth between the deliberative, conscious, directive mechanism of the system 2, or our rational faculty, or the rider, and the automatic faculty that we have. Next up is going to be Sydney, Kay, Jeng, Becky, and Jyoti. Sydney.
Thank you. For the first part, how do you get intuition? I think I'm going to Socratically answer the question with a question. And do we need to know that it's intuition? As I'm listening to what's being said and thinking of different things, in my case, because I feel I've experienced it throughout my life, the answer for me is yes. But if someone is able to make decisions, performing their roles, and it may or may not be intuition, so just posing it, the question, does one really need to know if they're using intuition? For the second part about with the conscious is, I'm thinking of it like a scale that balances. So you have it can go one way, whichever has the heavier weight, and that perhaps, I don't know, but perhaps part of it is an even balance of the conscious and the intuition. And to where it gets, where it's evened out, there really is not a scene of differentiation. And the one reason I'm thinking of that as an example is my Tai Chi classes. Now, I mentioned this, I think, once, but in 2012, I had a massive near fatal stroke. So when I still have a little challenge with my balance. I've recovered very well. But I mention that because, when I'm in Tai Chi or yoga, but it consciously comes to me, and I'm thinking like, oh, will I be able to do this? I need to get my brain trained to do it. And I'm using my conscious too much. So when a Tai Chi class I've been trying lately is just go with a flow, let it flow. Mm-hmm. And I get out of the mental part, which I think was said earlier by Mike or Dr. Wang, of not trying to focus on that too much. And when I go with the flow, it's totally remarkable. I mean, I kind of like, this might sound strange, but I'll end with this. I kind of wonder, being me, what's that person doing and how are they doing this? Because it's just so smooth. It's just, flow is the word.
Wonderful, thank you. Next up is going to be Kay, Jeng, Becky, and Jyoti. Kay.
I see intuition as a flash. It's very quick, and then your conscious jumps in. And that's when all your training and everything is, how do I evaluate that sense I just had? And it's usually, danger, not danger. I like this person, I don't. It's very subtle, right or wrong. And then you have all your training, everything you've ever learned, and your awareness of everything around you, you can draw on to give a reason to it and decide consciously how are you going to act given that message. and whatever it is. You know, even the best psychics get a shape or a word. They don't get a book for themselves. And so, you know, I think that's the most important part of it.
Thank you. Next up is Cheng, followed by Becky. Cheng.
Yeah, I think the knowledge and experience is the base, but the main thing is how you use or interpret or make connection between those experiences. Some people have lots of experience, they don't really learn from those. Some people may not have as many, but they were able to detect the connection between the limited experience and make more, that's we call them more intuitive, because they were able to use the limited resource and make stronger connection. I think that's, but you always can train yourself for sure, anything you can train. But also I like what Kay mentioned, because I have some friends who are very intuitive and they know some psychic, they can feel other people through the internet or phone, their physical condition. So most people, we are so disconnected with that kind of super ability. Maybe that's a different level. Like she said, she's living like 4, 5 dimensions, but usually means 3 dimensions, I guess.
Thank you. Next up is going to be Becky, Jyoti, and Brian. Becky.
I loved Zheng's answer. So, but yeah. So the base, what you know, allows you to tie across, and the strength of your intuition is how far apart your two subjects are, but also how tightly or how isomorphic that transition of the principle is from one to another. And so when that is like wide but real tight with that like mapping, that's when you feel intuition is like spot on, really strong. So you need to have expertise to really know. So building up to Joe's question about like, well, does your knowledge make you less intuitive? It's like, yes, if you lock into just your silo, but not so when you have all these different things and you're jumping across. That's the strength of intuition.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Becky. Next up is going to be Jyoti, followed by Brian. Jyoti.
Okay, in life, we gather a lot of experiences, and from those experiences, we draw some patterns in our life. And when we have to make quick decisions, I think those patterns come to help us to make a decision whether this situation is right, fake, real, what is going on in this situation. And those, I think the patterns in life are very important in forming intuition. Thank you.
Excellent, excellent point. Thank you. Next up is Brian.
Well, I don't have much to add what Becky and Jody just said. I really liked it. Also, comments from others. But the one thing that struck me, especially when Evanique was talking, is that in all of these circumstances, there's a risk involved if you don't respect your intuition. It probably arises in exactly the way that, let's say, Becky and Jody have described. And that suggests that you really ought to respect it. And if you reason yourself away from your intuition or your intuitive feeling, that's just a kind of, it may not be, you may be right in doing that, but there's a red flag there.
Wonderful. I want to end by asking Fred, and this question by asking Fred about the connection between preparation and intuition. So let me ask it as a concrete question. Now you have an intuition, intuitive ability as a surgeon, and you have seen the progress of it over your long career, 50-year career. Can you talk a little bit about how are you different now as you were when you were starting out in terms of intuition, and what role has your work, has your thinking, preparation played in that?
I think it's played a tremendous role. I agree with what everybody said, and I particularly like this last point about not trying to buck your intuition too much because there is a basis for it. I think that's one word that we haven't used yet tonight that I think is important, and that is whatever it is, intuition does have a basis. As I said initially, there's no magic. You know, it's often said that it takes about 3 years to learn how to do an operation. It takes about 20 years to know when to do it. And it takes a lifetime to know when not to. Part of our intuition also has to do with what we're going to, not only decisions, but what we're going to get into in the first place. And I think that will hold you very in a good position in life if you can, even on a gut level, on an intuitive level, know what the possibilities are and where you should go.
Wonderful. Thank you. Now I'm going to ask again, I'm going to ask everybody a tough question. And that is a question about testing of intuition. When is it that you trust your intuition? When is it that you need to, when you need to test it? And how do you know the difference between the two? So any thoughts about, you know, the process, or how do you do this? Go ahead and type exclamation mark if you'd like to answer. We'll start with Becky.
So intuition is one step before judgment. That's how I like to think about it. Judgment takes a little bit more because you need to make a stance, a position, or an action, and that's external. And when you externalize something that you think, other people can interact with it, which is what Joe had said before. Other people are going to end up giving you feedback. And so your judgment, when made in alignment with your intuition, can be very wrong or very right, or somewhere in between. So that's how I would test my intuition, and hopefully not always in action, because that's that leads to consequences, but more so in dialogue.
Wonderful, excellent point. Thank you. Next up is Jyoti, Joe, and Kevin. Jyoti.
Yeah, okay. I think I'm testing my intuition these days because I inherited my husband's business, and I have taken his feedback into account in forming intuition for myself. What worked for him? What was successful? Why he was successful? So I'm taking that into consideration and making quick decisions and risky decisions. And I have nothing to do with that. I'm just looking at the big scenario, that what has worked so far. And if it has worked so far, I'm going to go in the same line. If it didn't work, I'll just have to quit and I have to change the direction. So that's how I'm looking at it. What works and what has not worked. Thank you.
Thank you. Next up is Joe, followed by Kevin. Joe.
I can come up with just one example really quickly about how when we shouldn't trust our intuition, and I think that's when we're emotional, and we're in a situation where we're reacting to something that has just happened to us, and all of a sudden we think we should act right away. And so I think once, and that's where you have to determine whether you should really assent to that action and your beliefs. So that was just
wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Joe. Next up is Kevin, Allison, Laura, and Sydney. Kevin.
Yes, thank you. I would use our last year we learned all the loop, right? You need to observe yourself about your intuition and external feedback. Then is reoriented and decide again, act. Then you don't completely trust your own intuition. Also other, keep it do the circle. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Kevin. I like, I definitely think in terms of the OODA loop, and I like Robert Sapolsky's take on this: strong opinions loosely held. So you need to kind of have confidence in everything that you've done, everything that you've trained yourself for. But at the same time, you have to be open to feedback from either verbal feedback, from reality that you are on the wrong track. So I like that combination. Next up is Allison, followed by Laura. Allison.
I think it's just time will tell. I don't think there's really any one test, but if you just give something enough time, you'll see if your intuitions were correct or not. Yeah.
Cool. Next up is Laura. Laura, how do you distinguish?
Good question. I have to use my intuition a lot, and right now I have to use my intuition, and it's hard to know. I don't have anyone I know in the field doesn't know much about what I'm going to have to face with some medical surgery. Nobody knows about the surgery. Nobody knows, and so I have nobody to talk to. So I have to base my decision on my intuition about doctors. But I should be making an educated decision, but there's no way to do that. So got to trust my intuition, which has worked pretty well for me. But this is a really big decision because there's a lot of consequences if it's not the right decision. So what do I do? Intuition without, I don't know.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you, Laura.
If anybody has an answer to what to do when you're missing the next stage, let me know.
Thank you. Next up is Sydney, followed by Brian. Sydney.
Yes, as I'm listening and thinking, I realize that there are times when using our intuition may to make a decision or take an action may initially appear to go against what could be considered logically right. So that I'm thinking that possibly the idea of testing is looking at, I will call long-term effects. So not what I'm making a decision or taking action immediately may not have the results I or others wanted at that moment. But what if it's down the road, if it's a day or a week or a month or 2 months or longer, that expected, intended outcome occurs.
Thank you. Next up is Brian.
So I was, when to test, and also I think the related question, how to test. And then when that question came up, I was struck by something Joe had already said earlier, the Kahneman point. Look at others and watch others first. And what struck me then is that when the question was put, is that in my profession as a lawyer, other people have made intuitive guesses in the past. It's not just me alone. I'm not the first one to have dealt with this problem. And they made guesses, and they were tested by reality. We know the outcome. So we can test our intuition by looking at the outcomes others have obtained. And the way that worked in the legal profession is you would get together and in these professional conferences, and people would share in effect, what had been their intuitions. And over time, the outcomes become folklore and common knowledge. And that's a great way to test your intuition.
Wonderful. All right. So now we're coming to the last question. And I'm going to use a generalized version of the question that Brian put on the table. And many people found really interesting. And that is, what is the role of intuition and articulation in leadership? But let's keep leadership aside. In social interaction, which is, leadership is a kind of a social interaction. So what is the role of intuition and articulation in leadership or effective social interaction? Go ahead and type a exclamation mark if you'd like to answer that question. Just a second. Okay, we're going to start with Joe, followed by Chang. Joe.
All right, I was just kind of raising my hand because nobody else was. But anyway, so I'm
No,
going to
then,
wing
then
it.
let's go to Chang. Don't
Okay, let's go to Chang.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay, we'll come to you later. Okay, Chang, followed by Becky.
Yeah, I didn't follow anybody. Anyway, I think articulation, you know, I think as a green intuitator, when you are new, you are not experienced, then you can explain, you know, you just have this hunch, but you don't know why. But as you, like maybe as you thinking more, like more experience, then you actually can know. Just like some people know things, like you know how, like ski, I can ski, but I don't teach ski, you know, because I just do it intuitively. I don't even, and some people are very technical. They're like learning all these postures. They're like, I can ski down the hill, no problem, black, whatever, you know, double black. But some people just very technical. But I think once you reach, now I'm thinking maybe I'm going to teach ski next year. I'm going to be more technical. So I can understand why things work, because right now I'm more learned through the experience, but didn't reach the theory. You know, when you actually can combine your experience and combine with the theory, then you can articulate. Like people, some people can do things, they can coach, but people who can coach, they have to be able to articulate what did they do. That's a different level of understanding. I think you have to reach that level to be able to articulate your intuition.
Wonderfully put. Fantastic point. Thank you. Thank you, Chang. So it's going to be Becky, Fred, Sydney, Jyoti, and Joe. Becky.
So suppose you're a comedian and you see something that's funny and you're laughing. Well, only you get it. You're an audience of one. Everyone else, to someone's point before, thinks you're crazy because you're just laughing. But when you want to bring other people in, you have to set up the joke, right? And so you don't give it to them right away, but you're putting little pieces and enough for them to also intuitively eventually get to the point that you've gotten. And now a portion of the crowd is laughing. And then for the rest, if you want them to follow along, you explain the punchline. So it's bringing other people in, the importance of articulating and how you do it. It might exist there, but no one's following you. You know, you're just you're marching to your own drum. Unless you want to have a band, you gotta be able to play everyone's, or bring everyone to your tune, since you're the drummer. You said it, right? Right, Mike?
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Becky. Great point. Next up is Fred.
I was just thinking about this in the negative, and that is, why do I have to use my intuition in this particular circumstance of trying to size this person up or make this decision? And well, I have to because I'm missing something. What am I missing? I'm missing data. So when I go into a room and start talking to a group of people, I don't have access to that data. And I think that's an important point. So I have to glean it in some other way. I'm trying to gain what I'm missing, and I call that intuition. But if I had what I was missing, I would call it judgment. And I think Becky made that point before, and I think it was a brilliant point. Thank you, Becky.
Excellent.
So I would like to say that in those circumstances, when we don't have what we need, we have to use our toolbox, and in our toolbox is intuition.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you, Fred. Next up is Sydney, Jyoti, and Joe. Sydney.
Yes, along the lines, excuse me, what Becky was saying, that we may understand something a certain way, but if we don't communicate it so the other person or people can understand it, we don't have communication. As I coach people, communication consists of transmission and reception. So in transmission, I can say something, but it's not received, and the other way around, there's no communication. So along those lines, with Becky's drummer being in the band, I kind of like that, is that I think we need to be careful of not, and we're talking about articulating with others, I believe, not to say just what I know, but to say something or communicate something that connects with what others know. So if you think of like having a ball of string and somebody's 10 feet away, you hold one end of the string and you throw the ball. If you don't throw it toward them, they're never going to catch it. I have to intend that it's going to come to them. And so it's the other part that I've learned along the way also has to do with helping or addressing a person's need. And many things are around needs, not just personal needs. It could be something in the workplace, but if you show how something that you have a concept or an idea for addresses that need, I think they understand it better. The last thing I would just like to say is a little different, and I'm not going to go on with it, but I think we have to be careful not to discount our senses when it comes to the idea of intuition, of hearing and smell, and that they may tie into our knowing of things just because they trigger certain things in us. Thank you.
Wonderful. Excellent. And that point, we didn't get to talk about it in great amount of detail, the relationship between senses and all of this, as Fred was pointing out, we are animals, and our base is based on senses, and they go very deep. And many times, just take the audio sense, the way it works, it is actually responding to everything around you. The way in which your visual sense works is actually very different from that. The way in which touch works is quite different. And the way in which taste works is different. And they can communicate all the information. And our brain is very good at synthesizing information and making meaning of the information, not only for an individual source, but putting all the sense information together. Like when you're eating an apple, you're feeling the texture of it, you're tasting it, you're seeing it, you're smelling it, all of it is coming together. Next up is going to be Jyoti, followed by Joe. Jyoti.
Okay, I'm going to be the devil's advocate. I think the charm of intuition lies in being personal. It's very personal. However, if you want people to come on board with you, then you have to provide evidence of how did you gather, what notions did you gather or patterns you gather to make that hypothesis or intuition. So articulation is important. Yet, if you want to take the pizzazz out of your intuition, then you have to do it. Then you have to articulate, you have to provide evidence.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you. Folks, this is such an amazing group of observations. So as soon as we're done with this round, I'm going to ask you, what have you learned about intuition today? And try to formulate your question, formulate your answer in a very short terms. What did you get from this entire discussion today? Okay, that's going to be the next question after Joe, Evanique, Laura, and Becky. Joe.
So one of the things.
Thank you for volunteering first. And you got all these people to start off. So you got it started. Go ahead.
Thanks. And thank you for everybody else for bailing me out. No, I think that one of the important things is that you're following your intuition, and it is hard to articulate sometimes. And I think one of the most important things that you have to be able to do, and it kind of gets to what Sydney's point with how to communicate to others and connect with others. And I think one of the most effective ways of doing that is putting it into a story format. So kind of taking whatever you're trying to, your actions, and kind of at least coming up with something that makes some sense to somebody else, that connects, because they're never going to fully understand like why you feel this way or why this is going to happen. So you tell them a story and they have something they can relate to, and maybe that's something that they can buy into. And I think that that's one way of communicating your idea.
Wonderful. Thank you. Evanique.
Something Fred said had me thinking when he was saying, you know, sometimes our intuition, it's like we fill it in when there's something missing. So when you're in a situation and you can't put your finger on it, but a situation is kind of like what I'm doing now, right? Like you have something that you need to say or something's missing and you can't quite explain what it is. That's when your intuition kicks in and you bring in those past experiences, or you just kind of like, the intuition gets you to look. So maybe you don't have to act on the intuition. I know someone else had talked about, you know, you don't act on your intuition when it's emotional. Well, you may not have to do anything with it. You can just, like Becky was saying, you can just judge the situation or judge, you know, what to do. So it's kind of like what Fred said, it's a toolbox, like it's a tool in your toolbox. So you don't necessarily have to act on that intuition. You don't necessarily have to say anything or do anything with it. You can just observe and know in your mind that something's missing, and you can figure it out for yourself. And when you're articulating that, I don't think you articulate it until you, not to say have it all figured out, but that you figure it out enough so that it makes sense to the other person that you're communicating with. So once you figure out that missing component through your intuition, then you can say to the other person, well, I feel like, you know, this, and you may not have all the facts, but at least you can explain your point of view. And you can say it as exactly that, like, this is my point of view on this situation.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Evanique. Laura, what's the role of intuition and articulation in human relations?
Okay, well, I'm going to look at the point of view of, you know, you got to take it down to the street level. And it's sort of form is to function in this case, you know, and you got to take that intuition of this form and you've got to turn it into something applicable if you want to use it for some purpose, to solve a problem, to work with a person, even just to interact with somebody. So you have to make it tangible. And then through that, the tangibility gives you the ability, maybe indirectly, but you are expressing yourself and making yourself understood to that person.
Wonderful. Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you, Laura. Next up is Becky, and then we are going to go to the closing statements. What did you get from this meetup? What did you learn about intuition? What was new to you? What was a new thing that you learned today? Becky, Becky, your comment, and then we will go to this question.
Okay, sure. I liked what Sydney brought up about sensing, and that was one of Zheng's questions. And so in context of Carl Jung, sensing and intuition are on the same axis. And so if you think about it, it's like extroverted sensing. It's taking in what's happening all around you and being able to, in a very divergent way, you're using all your senses, all that awareness, and something ties, it's that aha, and it converges into that insight. Or the opposite would be using your introverted sensing, your past memories of things, and bringing all those together. Okay, I've experienced this before. This feels like that moment. This feels like that moment. And being able to be like, okay, well, from here, this can happen. And then that goes from a very convergent way of like, this happened in the past, to a very divergent way. Like, here are all the different possibilities that might come about it. So, so that there's a link between the sensing and intuition.
Wonderful. Beautifully put. And the way in which Carl Jung talks about it, it's like all the sensing that is outside is actually going to support the vision that you're going to have, and all your memories are going to form as a base for all the exploration that your intuition is going to do. All right, folks, so what did you get from this meetup? What did you learn about intuition today? Go ahead and type exclamation mark for your brief closing remarks. We'll start with Sydney. Sydney, what did you learn?
A takeaway for me is that while we have people, it sounds like most, at least those who spoke, mostly in agreement about that there is intuition, just how different the some of the perspectives are. And it sounds like, I'm not completely sure, that most of the responses and most of the relating to it had to do with people's professions. I didn't think I heard a lot about personal aspects, or let me put it this way, more about through someone's profession than their personal lives. The jokester in me wants to say I did not intuitively expect that. But it's the other thing is the events that I've been to tend, and understandably, this is my final word, tend to draw people who already agree on the topic. And to me, it would have been interesting with this one to have had some people who don't really agree with the idea of intuition and hear what their input would have been.
Yes, unfortunately, it is very difficult to get people who don't want to talk about a topic to intuitively come to discuss the topic. So there is an inherent problem in doing that. But you should definitely, I definitely value input.
And I did want to say thank you to you and the other gentlemen for leading this. I just want to make sure you know at least my appreciation for this.
Absolutely, thank you. Next up, wait a minute, Judy, did you have something?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I really enjoyed this session. I always thought that I was very intuitive, mainly because my Myers-Briggs says that I am very intuitive, and it's like way up the charts. But it also says that I am a perceptive, INTP. I am a T, thinker. I am a P, perceptive. And I think that intuition is very perceptive oriented. So, and I also think that on a personal level, and I'm glad that Sydney brought that up, because we haven't talked too much about the personal part. It happens in my experience that when I say I'm intuitive, I get a bad rap. So I'd rather not say that I'm making an intuitive decision or I'm making an intuitive thought, and just keep quiet, keep to myself, and trust it, but not entirely. The same as the logic and the rational part of my brain. Trust it, but not completely. So that's basically what I got. It's kind of like a mixed bag of things, but it's there, and use it. And I love the toolbox concept. Use it as part of your toolbox of all the things that you have at your disposal.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Judy. Next up is going to be Jyoti, Joe, Mike S, Mike A, and Chang. Jyoti. Jyoti, you need to unmute. What did you get from this meetup?
Yeah.
What did you learn?
Your question was, what did I learn?
Yes.
Right? Okay, so I'm not going to repeat what I already knew about intuition.
Exactly.
Right. So I like what Joe said. External feedback should be a part of intuition. Thank you and good night.
Thank you. Joe.
It's interesting because like one of the people that is kind of contrarian when it comes to intuition, I don't necessarily, I try and guard against it, to be quite honest, because I've read so much about being overconfident and trusting my intuition. So overall, what this has highlighted for me, and we've done this before there, you know, in certain other meetups with you, helping us trust our intuition when we were doing the writing exercises for 5 minutes. And we would sit there and we would say, okay, just write out and get your ideas on a piece of paper. And it's kind of like you're just, you know, really quickly, the constraint, you're putting your ideas out there, and and I feel like that's your intuition that you're putting out there. And so many times that I've actually kind of discounted my intuition. And what this meetup here this evening has showed me is the importance of it. And so, I mean, it's on a number of different levels, and how to, you know, essentially think about it in terms of, you know, our conscious and unconscious thinking and the relationship between those two, and to trust it a little bit more. I think that that's, you know, one of my major takeaways from this.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Joe. Mike S., what did you learn today?
Well, this gives us an answer to the curse of multidimensionality and the curse of nonlinearity. And in order to apply it, I'm sure that it's a multi-stage decision process which has to be merged with the OODA loop discussion we've had in order to be valid. And I can see that the medical world gives you exactly those kinds of opportunities. You get you have incomplete information, and so you build a little, you test a little, and you go to an answer. And in addition, with today's medicine, you don't have time to do, when you're in the midst of surgery, you don't have time to do all the tests that you need. You can't, while the patient is open, you can't stop and do an MRI. You have to keep going. And judgment is important. How do you get good judgment? From experience. How do you get experience? From bad judgment. And all that ties together into what we've seen today. And add that to defensive medicine, and add that to the fact that we still don't totally know what we're doing. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mike. Now, Mike A., what did you learn today?
Well, I learned pre-meetup, just from doing a little prep for Fred, I have a newfound respect for men and women who are making decisions where there are real consequences involved in that decision-making. I know that they don't have perfect information all the time. So the folks who have to make decisions sometimes by using imperfect information, going into this meetup, I have a newfound respect for those people, and you could list them any way that you like. Post meetup, I have a different, I don't want to call it a definition, but almost a picture in my mind of what intuition is to me now. I feel like I can come to a situation with the toolbox that we all have, that we use in real time. And when I'm confronted with something new that I'm not quite sure how to approach, I feel that my intuition is acting like a bridge. It's in real time reaching in and pulling out the tools that it needs for that moment. And I'm not sure that I'm consciously doing that. I don't know if I'm painting the picture, but that's what I got post meetup, aside from just a wonderful sit back to listen to everybody's comments. It was really great fun.
Wonderful. Next up is going to be Cheng. Cheng, what did you learn today?
Actually, I think I learned just opposite of what Joe learned. So I used to totally trust my intuition way more. And I need to get more feedback from others. And also I think intuition actually is the personal story. You know, I found intuition actually is pretty rational, actually, based on my experience, because when I was younger, as a relationship, I have this intuition. I know it works or not. But when the emotion kick in, I ignore that intuition. And after all this process, end up exactly how I intuitively feel at the beginning after all this time wasted. So I think intuition in that sense is actually rational. The problem is emotion, like many people mentioned, emotional actually some get in the way of intuition. So that's the two things I learned. One is, and also need to not just intuitive feel it, but also be able to clarify, present it to other people. That's also something I need to work on.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you. I mean, this is just fantastic observation. So please go on. Becky, what did you learn today?
Oh, I really liked what Fred said about for like intuition can be trained to be better, and it's through several different ways. It's through more awareness, and it's through experiences or like past experiences, memories, and so it's not hopeless for people who aren't strong in it. But to Fred's point, there are people who seem to be more intuitive, and he mentioned it was probably a genetic thing. And if you think about the way that your brains are, like we're born with certain predispositions, and we tend to lean in on what our strengths are, especially when we're young. And so that constant usage of certain ways of interacting with the world reinforces and strengthens that our neural pathways, and so that eventually manifests to be, you know, intuitive versus non, but that's not always the case, and we know that with self-actualization and growth, that with work anyone can really learn to be more intuitive. But also those who are intuitive, you're not always right, so you got to correct those your intuition with feedback.
I wanted to do one thing. I wanted to plug the work of Carl Jung in this. You know, he's spent a lot of time looking at intuition. He's spent a lot of time looking at, you know, the subconscious processes, kind of unconscious processes, and conscious processes, and the relationship between them. So I really like Fred's characterization of this as a toolkit. You know, our conscious mind is part of our toolkit. Our unconscious mind is a part of our toolkit. Our intuition is a part of our toolkit. Our articulation is a part of our toolkit. And they have different functions, and they are good at different things, and they are good in different contexts. So, for example, many times you kind of have a sense that, oh, something is wrong or something is right, which is at the edge of your consciousness. You know, you're barely able to sense that. So that's at the edge of your consciousness. And it's valuable not to ignore that. That's something that you are getting. At the same time, the conscious mind is tremendously good at articulating it, systematizing it, building your skills, building your ability. And as you build your ability, you start to see more things. It's not like a zero-sum game. You don't remain the same. As you build in training, as you build your explicit ability, your conscious ability, what your intuition can do not only increases, but where it can operate also changes. It's like, you know, some things you're mapped out. So things that are not mapped out now come into focus. So there is this amazing dance between that. I can barely, I don't understand it. It's just amazing. And it varies from context to context. And all of this is happening moment to moment, you know, and it's difficult to figure out moment to moment. It's difficult to figure out across time, across different areas of your life. It is even more difficult to figure out what is going on between people, because there are so much differences between people. And yet there are commonalities. So it's such a fascinating topic. And, it's just great, delighted to be talking about it. Laura, what did you learn? What did you learn new from this meetup?
My thought is something so. Fred said something about, and I think it was mostly that you probably shouldn't look to take a surgeon who's probably less than 100 years old based on the.
Yes, no, the sense is also real. He needs to be able to move his hand still.
Oh, right. No, but we have robots for that now. Remember, we don't need that anymore.
Okay, thank you. Brian, what did you learn?
Well, I learned that maybe two things, that intuition is an integral part of all of these, of a complete thinking process. That's the way I'd put it. And that so I learned a new respect for intuition is really an integral part of life. And the other thing I learned, and that's kind of in line with what Joe was saying. I think Joe really put it well. And then the other thing I learned is that, again, partly because there's all these different contexts and different people, that I need to respect the intuition of others, even if they can't articulate the conclusions that come out of it.
Wonderful. Fred, what did you learn from this meetup? Fred, please.
There, I got it unmuted. Yeah. I learned that you have a lot of bright people who are very perceptive in this discussion group. I learned a lot of points of view. And I think that putting all of those together may increase my intuition.
Wonderful. Fred, your comments were amazing. Just thank you so much for agreeing to come here. And I would completely agree with you about the people here. These are my friends. They're amazing people. And they keep coming back. And I think what is happening is that because we have, the reason for this level of conversation is that we know each other pretty well. And we have this tradition of kind of speaking out about how we understand things, regardless of whether people think that they would agree or disagree, and trying to learn from one another. So, it's wonderful. I missed all these people. I was away for 2 weeks and it was terrible. I've done 900 meetups and then I was gone for 2 weeks. So it's wonderful to be back. And thank you so much for coming. And Mike, thank you for choosing this topic. And thank you for bringing Fred. I think that was perfect. Any closing thoughts, Mike?
Not really. It's just, I like what you said a moment ago about us all being friends, and that really helps facilitate the conversation. I think that's a big key. So I consider all of you, my friends as well. Fred, can't thank you enough. I will see you tomorrow at 4:30. We have a chess lesson, don't forget.
The highlight of the week.
All righty, me too.
Wonderful. All right, folks, see you. I have to tell you that we've got Gita meetups tomorrow and day after. And on Sunday, Yasuhiko Kimura is going to be back. And he's going to be talking about new spirituality for the future. And he's going to be talking about a new philosophy, new cosmology, and a new ethic for the modern age. So it's going to be an amazing topic. So don't miss that. See ya. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you
Good
so
night.
much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, Mike Shank.
Bye.